2,500 years ago, a monk who owned nothing watched kingdoms rise and fall and left one word to describe what he saw: anicca, impermanence. Everything ends, not because it fails, because that is what all things do. Dalio spent 50 years and studied 35 empires to write the same sentence with data. The United States now pays more in interest on its national debt than it spends on its entire military. Dalio has studied every empire that reached this exact point. Not one of them recovered. But the thing that stopped me in this research was not the model. It was what Washington did when they read it. I came across Dalio's work the way most people do. A headline, a chart, a pulled quote. I kept skimming it. Then in January 2026, he published one sentence publicly, and I went back and read everything from the start. He said the United States had entered step 6. Before I explain what step 6 means, one number: over 50%. That is the probability Dalio assigned to some form of internal conflict inside the United States, not civil war. He clarifies that conflict. He published that in January 2026 and said publicly the country was a tinderbox. I know some of you are thinking that it's just a hedge fund manager being dramatic to sell books. He might be, but this is a man whose entire professional existence depends on assigning precise numbers to precise risks. Bridgewater Associates manages around $160 billion in assets. If he is wrong about this in public, he does not just lose an argument, he loses the thing his entire career was built on. That is the model we are about to walk through. The model says this: every major empire in the last 500 years went through the same 6 steps. You rise, you accumulate wealth, your currency becomes the currency everyone else uses to trade and save. You reach your peak. Then you borrow more than you can pay back. Fights break out inside the country. A rival power rises to challenge you. You fall. The Dutch Empire, the British Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Qing Dynasty. 35 cases, same steps, same ending. The sequence has never stopped because an empire had better technology than the ones before it. Dalio published his full model in a book called How Countries Go Broke in June 2025. It went straight to #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. In January 2026, he said publicly the United States had entered step 6, the last step. That sentence was published on a public website. Most people did not read it. The people who did were already in the next meeting. That mechanism starts with one number. Last fiscal year, the United States paid $970 billion in interest on its national debt. $970 billion. That is more than Poland and Sweden produced together in an entire year. The US military budget the same year was $917 billion. Look at those two numbers. The country that maintains global dominance through military power now pays more to its creditors than it pays to that military. That gap was not created in one room on one day. It was built so slowly that most people who were supposed to stop it never saw it as the same problem. Let me explain why this is more dangerous than it sounds. Think of it this way. You borrowed so much money that your monthly loan repayments are bigger than your rent. You still have the house. You still look fine from the outside. But every dollar going to the bank is a dollar that cannot fix the roof. The roof, in this case, is the US military. The bank is the national debt. Are you with me? Now, here is why this matters beyond the United States specifically. Every country in the world keeps savings. Most of them keep those savings in US dollars. Not because they love the United States, because they trust that a dollar today will be still worth something tomorrow. The moment that trust breaks, they move their savings somewhere else. And once enough of them move, the dollar stops being the world's reserve currency. In 2000, the US dollars made up over 70% of global government savings. By the end of 2025, that number was approximately 57%. That drop happened over 25 years. Most people never noticed. The slow phase does not announce itself, it just continues. In January 2026, Dalio said this out loud. My grandchildren and great-grandchildren not born yet are going to be paying off this debt in devalued dollars. That is not a framework statement. There is a man who has studied 35 empires describing what he sees when he looks at his own family. In 2025 alone, the dollar fell 39% against gold, 12% against the euro, 13% against the Swiss franc. If you hold US dollar assets, that move already happened. You may not have framed it that way yet. I want to be clear about one thing. The dollar is still dominant. The next largest reserve currency is the euro, at roughly 20%. There is no replacement ready tomorrow. I'm not saying the system collapses next week. I'm saying the direction of travel has not changed in 25 years. If this breakdown is useful, hit like and subscribe. I go this deep every week. The closest case in Dalio's research is not ancient history. It happened in 1956, and it happened to the country with the most powerful military in the world. At its peak, Britain controlled roughly a quarter of the entire planet. The Royal Navy was the most advanced fighting force on Earth. The British pound was the world's savings currency. Every major trade settled in pounds. Sounds familiar? Then came two world wars. Britain won both, but winning cost everything. The debt was enormous. The pound was already losing ground quietly. In October 1956, Britain launched a military operation to reclaim the Suez Canal in Egypt. Imagine you are Anthony Eden. It is October 29, 1956. You are the British Prime Minister. Your military is in position. The operation is underway. You are the leader of what feels like the most powerful empire on Earth. Then the phone rings from Washington. Eisenhower delivered one message: stop the operation, or the United States would sell its British pound holdings on the open market, not through battle, through money. The pound would have collapsed within days. Britain stopped the operation within a week. The most powerful military in the world stopped a war not because it lost a battle, because it could no longer afford to fight without the permission of the country that had replaced it. Britain's reserve currency status was gone within years of that call. Not because Britain lost a war, because the debt made the pound impossible to defend when the pressure arrived. US interest payments in fiscal year 2025, $970 billion. US defense spending, $917 billion. Not the same situation, the same structure. I want to hear from you on this. Dalio said Britain is the closest historical match to where the US sits right now. Do you think that holds? Or is America genuinely different from every empire that came before it? Tell me in the comments. On February 28, 2026, the US and Israel launched airstrikes on Iran. Iran closed the Straits of Hormuz. Oil crossed $100 a barrel on March 8, 2026. The International Energy Agency called it the largest oil supply disruption in the history of the global energy market. A ceasefire began on April 8. It collapsed. A full US naval blockade began on April 13, 2026. That is happening while I'm making this video. Most coverage is treating these as separate stories. The Iran crisis, the NATO fracture, the dollar slide. They are not separate, they are the same sequence. European allies refused to join the war. Trump called them cowards and threatened to pull the United States out of NATO entirely. On April 10, 2026, Al Jazeera reported the alliance is closer to a break than it has ever been. Canada's Prime Minister said publicly that the alliance may need to operate without the United States. When a country owes more than it can comfortably repay, uses military force to control a critical shipping lane, and its closest 80-year alliance starts calculating the exit. That is one story. Dalio has seen it 35 times. He calls the sequence Stage 6. Remember the number from the opening, over 50%. Dalio published that in January 2026. the same month he called the country a tinderbox. He was not predicting the Iran crisis specifically. He was describing the conditions that make a crisis like this the next logical event in the sequence. I know some of you are sitting with this and thinking, what am I actually supposed to do with any of this? That is the right question. This section does not end with a trade recommendation. What I'm personally watching most closely right now is the Strait of Hormuz. If that waterway reopens with US credibility intact, the dollar gets a pulse. If it does not, the oil disruption and the NATO fracture compound at the same time. That is the near-term hinge point for everything else in this model. Most of us were taught that American dominance is a permanent feature of the world, not a historical phase, a permanent condition. I carried that assumption for most of my life. It felt like physics, not history. Here's what Dalio's 35 cases actually show. Every empire in his dataset had the most advanced technology of its era at its peak. Britain had the most advanced naval technology the world had ever seen. The Ottomans had military capability no rival could match. The Romans built infrastructure no previous civilization had achieved. Technological dominance is not protection from the cycle. It is the feature of the peak. The thing empires have right before the sequence continues. The US has nuclear weapons, advanced AI, SpaceX, the most powerful conventional military in history. I want to be fair, those things are real. Dalio names AI specifically in his books as a wild card, an early bubble phase that might bend the productivity curve enough to matter. He does not dismiss it. But the question Dalio is actually asking is not whether US has better technology than everyone else. The question is whether the technology can generate enough growth to outrun a debt that is growing faster than the economy. That is the race the $970 billion interest payment is tracking right now. And here's what I kept coming back to after finishing this research. The Anicca, the monk described 2,500 years ago, was not a warning. It was an observation. He was not saying things should not end. He was saying that assuming something that will last forever because it has lasted your entire lifetime is not logic. It is familiarity. When I finished reading the research, I did not open my brokerage account. The question I kept writing down was this: do the people who understand this pattern the best have any more power over where it ends than the people who do not? Three things I'm watching. The next US budget negotiation. The Congressional Budget Office projects interest payments across $1 trillion in fiscal year 2026. Whether Congress closes that gap tells you whether anyone in Washington read past Chapter 1. The dollar's reserve share. It has dropped 13 percentage points in 25 years. Watch whether the pace accelerates in the second half of 2026 as the Iran crisis continues and allies start settling trades outside the dollar. And China. Dalio says the US-China tension over Taiwan is the most dangerous unresolved threat in his model. China has stayed quiet during the Iran crisis. Quiet is not resolved. Before Dalio's book published in June 2025, advanced copies were already circulating in Washington. The New York Times reported it had become a hot read among policymakers. The people making decisions about the debt, the military, and the dollar were studying the playbook for how empires fall. Then they kept going. 2,500 years ago, a monk who owned nothing described this with one word. Dalio spent 50 years and studied 35 cases to write it with data. The people who had both in their hands before the story became a headline were already in the room. If the pattern has run across 500 years and 35 empires, and the people who understand it best are the ones managing the sequence right now, what exactly are they planning that you are not? If this video helped you see the story underneath the headlines, hit like and subscribe. I go this deep every week.